love to have you closer together. And thank you so much for coming. I know it was a very hard choice. I almost went to the girl effect, except that I'm moderating this battle, so that didn't work. No, I'm just kidding. In truth, it is a huge pleasure to be moderating this session on shared societies. It is a vital and very compelling concept, the notion of setting out what should be the goal, what kind of society we want to shape. What is a shared society? It's inclusive, it's empowering, it's respectful, and it's fair. Shared societies are marked by a mutual respect for common dignity, equality of opportunity, the absence of discrimination. Today we're going to hear from some powerful and insightful minds about this concept of a shared society. And we have a real treat in the chance to hear from Clem McCartney, who's the author of the notion itself. He developed the concept as a norm on behalf of the Club de Madrid and has really helped put it forth into the world. He and our other panelists are living examples of what it's like to try to put a shared society into effect, to chart the shortfalls and attack them, and to work the problem and say, how do we get to that ideal? Consider this session something of a kind of working, because inevitably, a shared society isn't just a theory. It's not a lofty goal. It's not the El Dorado of the international system. It's actually practical. It calls on policy solutions. It has real-life interventions. And for all of us who care to see a shared society happen, there is work to do within our own domains to get to that point. Now, as we begin, I also want to plant a notion in your head that this concept of a shared society, this ideal that Clem is going to help us understand, is something of a spectrum. In some ways, society may already be there when it comes to access to healthcare or access to education. In other ways, we may be falling short. It's not all one metric or all one dimension. We may also see societies shift and move as a function of time along that spectrum. We all have a sort of personal experience to bring to bear when it comes to the kind of societies we want to see. In my personal experience, I'm the daughter and the great-granddaughter of refugees from situations where in both of those societies they lived in, society went from an inclusive, shared society to one where trust between ethnic and religious groups broke down. The social fabric of society tore beyond recognition. So societies move along that spectrum of being the ideal and then losing the most sacred tenets of what a shared society would represent. So think of that as we move through this session, this notion of a flexible and sliding scale of a shared society. As you listen to our speakers, each one brings to bear their expertise on how you move a society further along that spectrum to a better place. And you also get a sense by listening to them of what's at stake. Why is this so important? And why even set out an intention, an ideal, to work toward some sort of common goal? Because in absence of that, we simply drift along all of those same dimensions. So think about what's possible, think about what's at stake, think about how we preserve those elements that are the best elements we have, and build on what's missing. How do our societies move closer to that given ideal? And how do we get there? I leave it to Clem McCartney to help us start answering that question. Clem, the floor is yours.
Well, this is a question that the members of the Club de Madrid were faced with. How do we do this? I've got my slides in the wrong order here, my printout, so I'm not sure if I can follow what I'm intending to do here. But it was a question that was faced by our members. The Club de Madrid, as you know, probably by now, is an organisation made up of heads of state and heads of government, presidents and prime ministers. There's about 90 of them. And they try to look at particular issues which face the world today. His overall interest is about democracy that delivers, is a tagline that they use. But within that overall interest, it looks at particular issues which face the world today. And one of those is social division, social tension, social violence. It may be violent, but it may not be, but it's still a wasted society if some people are left out. And so they wanted to think about how one could create and how one could debate and discuss what was needed in order to create a much more socially positive society. And so I've already, in the earlier session, sorry, how do I move? That helps. So I've already said something about what is a shared society in the earlier session, and also this other description of it here. But I want to go on from that, as I said this morning, and talk a little bit about what we've just thought about it in terms of the practicalities of doing it and what's involved. And so we asked the question, how do we build and maintain a shared society? And the conclusion we come to is that you do it by making and keeping 10 commitments. Not 10 commandments, but 10 commitments. And we identified 10 areas, 10 elements within any society which could be a problem and which needed to be addressed. And these are the 10 areas here. And I have a little we have a little leaflet with me here, which there should be somewhere about in this building, a little leaflet about the Shared Societies Project, which gives a very quick summary of these ideas that we're talking about here. I don't want to go through these in too much detail, but you can read for yourself what we think are 10 areas that need to be addressed. And some of those are clearly the responsibility of government. It's the government that has to decide, for example, that there should be somewhere in government structures which takes responsibility for this and answers if there is problems. But there are some of them which government can only help, only can enable. And someone this morning in the first session talked about enabling government. And so, for example, when we talk about promoting respect and understanding and appreciating of diversity, that is something which happens between people at a civil society level. But government in its approach can either facilitate that or deny that, help it or hinder it. So I don't want to go through the 10 in detail, but we can come back to them and ask me about them if you wish afterwards. The important thing for us is they all need to be done together. Many people tend to say, we have a problem, we'll fix it with a particular approach, a particular strategy, a particular weapon. So for example, if you look at creating opportunities for consultation, at the end of the Soviet era, when the states of Eastern Europe began to be developing their own post-Soviet systems, a lot of issues arose about minorities, and many of them created councils on minorities, calling them different names. But that in itself doesn't solve the problem. It's part of solving the problem, but many other things need to happen as well. So you can address that second commitment and say we'll do something about it, but if you're not also addressing all of the others, you're failing. Another example, we were talking a lot about health this morning, and we said that there's an issue about making sure health is available, but also it's what kind of health and how is that health presented to people. And I was thinking as I was listening this morning, I heard someone talking about Nepal just the other day here, which was about people don't use the services which are offered. And on another occasion I heard someone the former Minister of Health in Peru talking about how people in the indigenous communities didn't use the services that were offered because they didn't respect the dignity of the people concerned. They didn't present it in a way which fitted with what they need. So for sure you need the government input and the resources from donor communities to make sure that the facilities are provided. But you also need to have this attitude, this orientation, which ensures that they are provided not only in a physical sense, but they're provided in a way which fits with the needs of people. So therefore, we don't try to say, do one of these or do another one of these, we say we have to do all of them. Now, I don't think there's any society or any country which doesn't do some of these. But there isn't any society either which is not failing in one or two of them. And so when our members engage with countries, we may talk about what are you doing in this area, what are you doing in that area, and looking for the areas where development and change can take place. I guess we could come to Norway and we could go through this list and say some of those were spot on, but there's others where we could do more. So the idea of the 10 commitments was a way of trying to structure our thinking about what needs to be done. It's all collected together in this booklet here, which I don't have copies of, but which we can get copies to people if they want them. Why is a shared society important? Is it important? Well, it's important because it's intrinsically right. It's only fair, it's only responsible that everybody should have a full access and full capacity to take part in society. So we start with the basis that it's intrinsically right. But it also makes sense in other practical ways, and that's, I think, quite important. For a start, it uses all the human capital of those living there. What a waste we have when a quarter, a half, maybe two-thirds, three-thirds, we'll be talking about South Africa later. Look how many people were not fully engaged, fully involved. That's an awful lot of waste of human capital. It allows people to realise their ambitions, and if people realise their aspirations, they then contribute to the overall society. There are many societies where immigrants don't really have an opportunity to play a full part. But once they do, then they become entrepreneurs, they become active members of society, and real contributors to society. It encourages everyone to contribute to society, knowing that in turn society supports them. Why should you pay your taxes if society doesn't offer you a place in the society? If the society offers you a place, you're more likely to engage and take part in contributing, even in that one practical way, but in many, many other ways as well. And it brings out responsible care for society's shared resources. People are more likely to look after the society if they feel they have a stake in it. If they've no stake in it, they leave rubbish, they take what's available, and they don't contribute back. So it's also got a lot to do with sustainability. So it makes sense. Oh, I pressed the wrong button again. So we have that also in another book, which we create a cycle of, if you develop a shared society, we create economic well-being. If you create economic well-being, you in turn are contributing to a consolidated shared society. You then get an appropriate economic framework within which people can develop a shared society. So we talk about a virtuous circle in a number of different ways, but for one, we'll talk about it in economic terms. And we did this in a book which we called Economics of Shared Society, which is also possible to get to you if you want to have a copy. But what happens if a society doesn't do this? We lose the potential contribution of marginalised groups. We then create intergroup tension, increased cost of security, violence, disinvestment, etc., etc., etc. So there's a downside if we don't do it, and there's an upside if we do it. And when our members engage with countries and societies, we explore both the upside and the downside. We don't tell people what to do. We say you've got to work on these areas, and if you don't work on them, these are what might be the consequences. And sometimes our members will say, I didn't do it in my country, and look what happened. So this is, as I said, all in this booklet here. These are a little bit about the members of the Club of Madrid. There's 90 plus members. They all try to contribute. Not all of them are directly involved in this particular program. Some of them are very heavily involved, some of them less so. The other thing I want to say, and I began to touch on it earlier, is that this concept we are finding is particularly useful. It's not only useful in terms of thinking about how to build a shared society. Because of these virtuous circles that we talked about, of which the shared society is one part, it can be a positive driver of development, the last one that I've put up there. If people are involved, if people can participate, if people can contribute to society, then other things will flow from it. So it's a very useful concept for starting a discussion in any particular country or in the world as a whole. But it then needs to be able to be relevant to very many other issues and very many other aspects of society. I won't go through the others, you can read them for yourself, and I'm conscious time is probably running. But so, what we're really saying is that these are things that you get, more things that you get, and when you have all those things working together, developing together, then you have a shared society, or you should have. We have a shared society. So when we were looking at the, trying to describe that in a global sense, we have produced another leaflet which should be available somewhere in the building, which we call Towards a Global Society Agenda to Promote Long-Term Inclusive and Sustainable Growth. So we were trying to say, if you take this approach, and it then ripples out into many other things, and this is a template, if you like, of the kind of things you could do. We particularly tried to promote this with people like the IMF, who are beginning to learn the message but haven't already. And of course it very much relates to the post-2015 agenda, because if we are arguing that if you involve this aspect into the thinking about it, we don't just deliver services, we don't just have a target of so many girls attending school as we did with the MDGs, so many people having access to clean water. We have a perspective and an orientation which leads these things to be developed. So that is more or less a very brief introduction to what the project is about. We can go back and discuss that in its meaning with the other speakers. So thank you very much.
So this concept that you offered didn't come from nowhere. It came after a very rigorous study of different societies and what worked and what broke down.
Yeah.
I asked you yesterday a kind of ridiculous question, which was, which country, which society do you see out there that most fits that ideal?
Well, there are various countries which, well, as I said in one of the early slides, every country does some of these things, but there's not any country that does them all. So we can see places which are very good in some ways and are not so good in others. But Botswana is a good example of a country which is trying to bring together the different sectors of that society. In some ways, Mauritius, these are fairly small countries, but Mauritius, which had no indigenous natural population. Well, you remember when the colonizers went there was nobody living there except the dodo. And then now there's a multitude of different people from different countries. So no one can claim this was my original society. And I'm not saying there's not problems there, and our member from Mauritius wouldn't say there's not problems there, but it touches somewhere towards what we're talking about. If I give one last example, which is Switzerland. Switzerland is very good about how French-speaking, German-speaking, Romansh-speaking, and Italian-German Swiss get on together. It's not exactly a very good model in terms of how it welcomes immigrants. So a country can be very good at combining some sections together, but pretty poor at involving some other sections.
Very excited to jump into more of the policy interventions that you recommend when we get to our panel discussion.
Okay, thank you.
And our next speaker, Saji Prellis, is the Director of Children and Youth Programs at the Search for Common Ground.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I know we just had lunch, but I just want to make sure we're all here. Thank you for that introduction. My name is Saji Prellis. I work for an organization called Search for Common Ground. But before I get started, I wanted to take a minute to acknowledge and thank Partnership for Change for organizing this series of conferences, annual conferences. And the concept of it is working in partnership, because we realized that we cannot influence or shape societies by working alone together. But the idea is to work across dividing lines, bringing partners and agencies together. So what Partnership for Change is, bringing academics, bringing governments, bringing civil society, NGOs, youth organizations, women's together to stitch a fabric back in a way that creates and shapes the world we want to see. So I really want to congratulate Partnership for Change on that vision, and I'm glad to be part of that. So thanks for their leadership. As I get started, I wanted to see who is in the audience here. Raise of hands, how many business leaders are in the room? Business leaders. Government people. Anyone from government? Any government? One. Any academics, scholars? 1, 2, 3. What about students? Fantastic. NGOs, international NGO. Oh, fantastic. I feel like I'm at home now. Thanks, that's fantastic. So that's what we need. We need more of us. Not just NGOs, but we need all of us to be in the room to help shape this shared society that Clem just very powerfully explained to us, the building blocks that are needed for it, and values and the commitments that are enshrined in getting there. So thank you, Clem, for that. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking a little bit about the challenges and the ways of addressing those challenges in some of the countries that we're working in. Clem said there's no country that is ideal, but there are gaps and strengths in a lot of these countries. So as we aspire to reach to this shared society concept, we have a long ways to go in a lot of places. And the Search for Common Ground is an organization, it's an international conflict transformation, peace-building organization, whose mission is to end violent conflict. That's our mission. And we work in about 34 countries around the world. And the countries we work in, we see that conflict, what it really does, it really splits and rips the fabric out of the society. It makes us believe that we have so many differences and not enough commonalities. Right? It popularizes the notion that sometimes doing bad is better than doing good. And those are the societies we work in. So I'm going to share a couple of stories with you about people in these societies, how they are engaging. And it reminds me of a young boy from Bangui. Do you know where Bangui is? Central African Republic. It's in the news now. There's a potential Bangui. There's a potential genocide unfolding in the Central African Republic, and that could be potential for regional conflict, right? Charlie is a 17-year-old boy. You know what makes him popular and cool? He has an AK-47, and he has a cell phone and a motorcycle. That's what gives him strength. On the other side, but what is he doing? Because why does he choose those tools to make him feel like he's a man, he's cool, and other people look up to him? Because it's a mode of survival for him. But also he had no choice in joining the rebel movement, the Seleka group. So that's one piece. And this boy is about this tall, and he's commanding a lot of people. But in northern Nigeria, what is northern Nigeria now famous for? It's been in the news. What's going on in northern Nigeria? I can't hear you. Kidnapping. Bring back our girls, hashtag, right? So, two girls. One girl's name is Fatima, and the other one is Joyce. Between the ages of 15 and 17. Are you familiar with northern Nigeria at all, some of you? So in the northern part, we are working with many of these girls, many of these Fatimas and Joyces, and what they are doing is different than Charlie's. One is a Christian woman, and one is a Muslim woman. And they're brought up from their parents and uncles and aunties to believe that the Christian people are bad. And the other people are saying, those Muslim people are burning and killing us and destroying our villages. And that's the narrative they're growing up and believing. That's their normal. So they don't see each other as common. But what they're doing, though, is something different. They are taking the courage to learn about the other. They're talking about what Islam means, what Christianity means. They have so much in common. They pray in similar ways. They all are devout. And also, the parents of Muslim and Christian families, they have something in common. They all want their kids to be educated. But the popular narrative is that there are divisions. So what they do, these girls, these young women do, is get on the radio and talk about issues that matter to them in northern Nigeria from a religious perspective. Young girls, 15 to 17-year-olds, changing the narrative of what is a shared society like. And they're getting on the radio. Why is radio so popular? Sometimes more than television. What it does is enables people to imagine without putting a picture to show what it is. So it takes you on a journey, what it's like to find something common. And what else is happening in this situation? Adults who sometimes think of these young girls who should be at home or should be married at the age of 15 have a different interpretation of what young girls are capable of doing. They think, wow, these girls talk about things that I care about. What they're sharing is something I want also. And the more we repeat these radio shows, their weekly radio programs, they're realizing, wow, these young boys or young women in this situation have similar issues, but they are concerned about society. And that's something across the world we work with, a lot of youth movements around the world. Their leadership process is horizontal. The way they communicate is sometimes misunderstood by adult populations. So how do you work, not only one of the dividing lines is conflict, but also generational. How do you work with people in a society that includes young people and adult counterparts who might not always agree with them, who might not see them as partners? And media we use as a tool to try to understand, put a face to, so you should understand that this is an identity that people have, and make sure that it's popularized. Because a lot of these countries, guess who their population is? They older? No, they're all young. In the Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, the life expectancy is 47. So it's a young population in a lot of these places. So enabling that youthful population to understand that there is more in common than these conflicts that are ripping us apart is about getting to that shared society. I think one of the 8th commitment was done. To do that, we use media tools. There are lots of other examples like this, but I also wanted to make sure that we have enough time for a conversation to shape up. So I wanted to stop there and allow our other speakers to bring in their excellent stories, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Saji, of course, the post-conflict context is the most extreme. As you know, I focus on Syria. It's a situation where you had a semi-shared society and now a total breakdown. From your experience, you used a fascinating word talking about Joyce and Fatima. That was their normal. How do you change the normal after a conflict? How do you get to a place where the things Clem is talking about are even possible in the climate involved?
I think that change, we cannot expect that change to happen if we start today, that the change is happening tomorrow. I think it's very foolish of us as policymakers or program people to think that change is going to happen if we throw money at a problem. These things take a generation, and we have to look at it as a long-term way of being engaged and making sure that those commitments are on the long term. I think in that society where that fabric is ripped apart, getting that fabric stitched back takes time. I'll give you an example. Imagine you, when you first broke up with your loved one, with the loved one that you were friends with. How long did it take for you to come out and say this person is a good person? Sometimes it takes a while, right? So now imagine this at a societal level, where hundreds of thousands of people are feeling really frustrated and angry with these other people. That can take a generation. And to do that, it's not just making sure, yesterday at the Burma panel there was a thing about you can't do peace building without development and development without peace building, but you also have to make sure people having food on the table. In a lot of these places, poverty and lack of food is a huge issue, but making sure people are part of something bigger is so much more important, right? I think people who are very well educated have likelihood of getting into conflicts are still high. But if people are belonging to something greater, and let's popularize, if I may, let's popularize doing good, not evil. Let's make that the sexiest thing. I know that's an older term. Let's make that the clarion call. Then getting those bad people who are troublemakers to take on the narrative. And to do that, media plays a role. To do that, societies play a role. Education is one, but education alone can't get us there. If we don't believe in it ourselves, we have to walk that talk. So it's a long-term engagement process, but it has to come from within, and making sure that people feel like they're part of a larger thing. So that the street cleaners and the doctors and the lawyers and the teachers all feel like they're part of building and stitching that fabric back together. And the visible evidence is also there to feel like they're making a difference. So that takes a lot.
Thank you so much, Saji. Our next speaker is Luther Lütke, who is the President and CEO of the Education Development Center at MIT. What I found so fascinating about Luther's work is that he's actually working the problem. He's taking one dimension of a shared society, equal access to education, and also, equally important, outcomes, the achievement levels of education, and working the problem, focusing R&D efforts, significant investments into how do students around the world access education and how do they achieve through education. Luther, the floor is yours.
Clem's reference this morning to somebody who came up to him last night and said, I've just discovered online what shaping shared societies means, which was something of a new concept. That was me. And when I happily landed with this wonderful group of people, I've known Saji for years, and I had to sort of bone up on what shared societies are. And I thought, hey, that's us. It's a new way also of appreciating and looking at what EDC does. The business cards read EDC, the founding name, it's still a legal name, Education Development Center, but I think in this context particularly, it's useful to use the root name of the organization. EDC does so many things now that for nuance and branding, sometimes we shy away from it a little bit. But the logo, the tagline for the organization is Learning Transforms Lives. And that's a theme certainly that runs through this gathering as well. And the power of education, not just in formal school settings, but in other social contexts, in informal, out-of-school settings, all the way from very early childhood development through university and beyond. EDC was established at MIT in the 1950s in response to the Sputnik Challenge to revolutionize American science and math teaching. And very quickly produced what was a very advanced, hands-on, student-engaged mathematics and science program, which is still a large part of what we do as a larger organization. Our first international forays, in fact, were the Africa Math program in the 1960s, and leading the coalition of American universities that founded the Indian Institute of Technology at Kanpur, slightly more than a half century ago. We're a nonprofit international development organization, international NGO. About half our work is in the US, half in developing countries, mostly global south. It means slightly over $100 million a year of activity in developing countries. And about half of our 1,400 staff are working in development context, the other half in the US. And as I think about social cohesion and what we do that addresses positively the risk of hostility and conflict, there are a couple examples that came to my mind. We do not focus on democracy and governance as a primary area for EDC. Our focuses internationally are on basic education, on youth and workforce development, and increasingly on global health. But education is not a value neutral or agnostic activity. And I'm particularly struck for the purposes of this gathering by the work that we did in Somalia for about a decade with interactive radio. And the SIRIP program, Somali Interactive Radio Instruction program, comes very much to mind. I think it was 3 years ago that there was a pre-session for Partnership for Change with the Somali youth in greater Oslo area, which I was glad to be part of. And just a couple quick words about how interactive radio works. It seems like such an ancient technology, given where we are now. But radio is still the most ubiquitous communications channel that we have in the world. And I won't talk about the other places where we've used interactive radio, but particularly for Sudan and to Somalia. We were able to come in by shortwave and also by FM and AM to areas that are unelectrified and unserved, although increasingly they are served with mobile access as well. And as we developed some significant expertise in putting the first 4 years of basic education out through interactive radio in a way that trains both teachers and leads the students through sequential learning over a 4-year period. The largest audience that we have reached with interactive radio is in India over an 8-year period and in 7 states where we reach 43 million school children through interactive radio and train 500,000 teachers. It really has a great capacity to scale. But one of the features of the program in Somalia was using children's stories. as a means for language and literacy, but also for cultural appreciation and preservation. There was a secondary school teacher in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, just outside Minneapolis, which has a large Somali population as well, who, as a means of engaging her kids, asked them to tell their stories, and the stories that the families brought with them. And these were transcribed and published. And when we picked these up, we began to use these as a medium for instruction in Somalia. And there are currently 4 different levels, beginning with a primary level. It sounds almost like Aesop's fable of the story of the fox and the crocodile, the hyena and the sheep, the elephant and the squirrel, the sheep and the goat. And you can tell by the titles of these that they assume that there's a built-in antagonism or conflict of size or power. And the stories are told, and the moral is derived at the end. And that's part of the interest and the excitement of learning. And these succeeded so well that they were taken to a next level of chapter books. And there's a series of 7 with titles like Honesty and Trickery, Leadership, Good Deeds, Choice and Marriage, and where's what I'm looking for? About the evils of chewing khat and the bad things that it does to your health. And there's a 3rd series beyond this as well. And eventually we ran out of stories that the children had in their families or their locales and developed competitions for children to develop their own stories, their own fables. And it's really wonderful stuff. Books actually are available on Amazon, and they're sold fairly widely in Stockholm and have some distribution in Oslo as well. And it was out of this kind of work and our expertise in radio that EDC was tapped in the lead up to the South Sudan referendum to build a public radio station in Juba, which is the South Sudan radio service. And it was a very sophisticated station which was staffed with stringers working in Khartoum and elsewhere, untrained young people traveling incognito with their recording devices who would send back testimonials from the field. But it was a way of putting out in 8 languages relevant information, the kind that we would expect from National Public Radio in the US or BBC, to a population leading up to the time of the independence referendum. And we like to think that it actually had something to do with the scale of the vote and with the positive outcomes. And I feel a lot of satisfaction that we're actually doing something to help shared societies. And I want to thank you for the heightened appreciation that you've given me for my own work.
Before you go, Luther, before you sit and wait for the panel discussion, you are laser focused on innovating education. You brought us an example of how you innovate content. You also innovate methodology. You look at how these students absorb material in the classroom. Of all of these interventions that you've experimented with and put into place, what kind of impacts have you seen on the communities where these things are trying?
If I weren't here, I'd be in the girls' session right now, and the choices that people make. And there is such strong data on what difference a couple years of girls' education makes. And in delayed marriage, in reduced sexually transmitted diseases, lower birth rates, increased earning power as well. And increasingly, we have the data for this. And there's a good expectation for international NGOs like EDC that we need to be able to demonstrate that the investments are having an impact, and a qualitative impact and a quantitative impact. Just one other comment in the area of innovation. So much of the work that we do now has moved to mobile platforms in West Africa and elsewhere. And it'll be a long time probably before most of the southern or the global south has the same kind of internet connectivity or smartphones we have here. But it's remarkable what you can do on feature phones as well, with the kind of storage capacity that they have.
And you told me
increasingly,
feature phones aren't smartphones, they're less expensive.
They've all got them. And,
How much are they per set, you told me? $35 for
right.
one of those?
You can get a very, very capable mobile device now, and also move through the marketplace through kiosks, apps and modules for about 75 cents each that include volumes of agricultural information or health information or education programming.
Incredible.
That's part of the good news.
Incredible. We'll dig into it
Okay.
more. Thank you. And our final panelist, Sarifa Mullah Nunais, come on up. She is an incredible woman who's brought the shared society concept home to Norway, involved in its development at the Club de Madrid, and really you described yourself kind of sparking a conversation. So tell us about that and tell us your story with the shared societies.
Yeah. Thank you. My name is Sarifa Mullah Nunais. Ik heb Bunde Konoe from Hardanger. I'm just saying I'm a farmer's wife from Hardanger. I am here via Club de Madrid. Thanks to Clem, I am here standing in front of you. But I am an employee of Red Cross, Hordaland Red Cross. And I work as a refugee guide coordinator and focusing on the integration of refugees in an area called Kvam. I come from South Africa. I've lived here for about 5.5 years. But I'm from South Africa. Born and raised in South Africa, from the Makua community, a minority community of freed slaves based in Durban. And I think I can relate to what Saji was saying in terms of it's not just about talking the talk, but it's about walking the talk. And for me, that's what Club de Madrid represents. And I'm saying this not because I'm trying to sell Club de Madrid, but I know Clem from United Nations of Youth, and he called me up one day and said, you need to come and be part of the panel of experts. I'm no expert, I'm just an activist from Durban. How can I contribute? And he spoke about the members that were there, and I'm thinking, that's way out there for me. I have nothing to give. But I must say, I'm glad I actually went to the meeting in November and engaged with academics, engaged with former presidents and prime ministers, and then realized, I have something to share. I am somebody. And using my experience growing up in youth activism in South Africa, I was able to contribute to what we have and Clem is talking about today. But I'm going to speak to, first and foremost, coming from South Africa. In 2007, I'm still part of a young women's poetry project based in Durban called Young Besatsi. And so when we get very frustrated, we use poetry to articulate how we feel. And I have a poem that I'd like to share with you very quickly that gives a picture of how I saw South Africa around 2007, 2008. And the fact that, we have a lot of potential, and I'm being very positive. But part of me feels that the whole idea of shared societies should have been introduced to us around 94, maybe even a bit before 94, so that Nelson Mandela's, who were negotiating, had a bit, a clear vision of how to bring us forward post-1994. And my poem is called I Cry, My Beloved Country. I cry for my beloved country that wears the mask of democracy and freedom, yet allows her men to go around raping her daughters without a condom, listening to their side of the story and allowing them to go free while their victims are made to flee. Forced into exile by a celebrated democracy, oh Lord, this is indeed hypocrisy. I cry for my beloved country that has no respect for its elders, where they are robbed of their pension and made to live like beggars. These people, our libraries, source of wisdom and history, should be treated like kings and queens instead of dragged through a life of poverty. Our elders should enjoy their age while they prepare to leave the stage. I cry for my beloved country that sits back and watches children being violated and murdered, and their murderers, violators, get minor sentences or go unreprimanded, where these innocents are forced into adulthood by major responsibilities like HIV/AIDS, major responsibilities. HIV/AIDS has robbed them of their possibilities. I cry for my beloved country that has children running around with weapons, turning into thugs and senseless demons, victimizing their peers and elders, destroying any glimpse of promising futures, wanting to be like their heroes Tupac, Snoop Dogg, or Eminem, delinquents who are dead in and out of jail or even don't know them. I cry for this beloved country that has forgotten the meaning of Ubuntu. Shared societies to me is about Ubuntu. Umuntu ngomuntu ngabantu, I am because of you, you are because of us. These words have become blasphemic, all parts of political jargon and rhetoric, like holistic sustainable development or transparency, gender equity and equality, with leadership's selective amnesia and government's verbal diarrhea. This country, my country, is sick. So, while Clem has spoken a lot about our mission, our commitments, I'm going to speak more on the practicalities of it, because I, being part of the advisory panel, but also working at grassroots, feel that, well, why I can relate to Club de Madrid is because we work at different levels of society. It's not just the top-down approach, but it's also the bottom-up approach. It's how do we empower, I mean, Paulo Freire spoke about, creating that critical mass. How do we empower the masses to put pressure on government, to ensure that policies are sustainable, to ensure that policies are gender sensitive or women sensitive, children sensitive, to ensure that societies have that vision of shared society that respects every single person within that society. And for me, that's what I worked with when I was in South Africa. And then I had to move to Norway because, love makes you do crazy things. So I moved to Norway and I was stuck. Who am I? Where do I go from here? How do I find my voice? Because I lost my voice when I moved to Norway. One, because I didn't speak the language. And then, automatically your husband has to speak on your behalf and your voice is lost. So I had to learn Norwegian, and I learned Nynorsk, which I think is beautiful. And it was a challenge. How do I share me? How do I share the vision of shared society? How do I share Ubuntu within this new context? And thank God I got a job with the Red Cross, working with integration. And it was a big challenge because my job description is to recruit Norwegians to become guides or friends to refugees. But when I started, I then realized that when they were talking of integration, what they actually meant was assimilation. You're going to come into our society and be the best Norwegian that you can be. But I'm African, I'm not Norwegian. I have, knowledge systems that I bring with me. I'm a Pan-Africanist and I'm not going to apologize for it. So I come with that baggage and I want to share. And I'm very talkative. So it was a challenge not being able to speak the language in the beginning, but after that, once I learned the language, I started visiting the older people in society, in the communities, to find out how was Norway before, to draw comparisons and parallels, to understand what I'm getting myself into. And I think, going to the Club de Madrid meetings and just sort of being empowered as a young activist with all these older people that had so much knowledge, information, and experiences to share, reminded me that, you can do it too. Because they were also at that level you were at some point. And I must say, one of the nicest things of meeting some of these people is the fact that they do not talk down to you. They see you as a person, as an activist, as someone who can contribute to change, and are always willing to listen to what you have to say. And that is what we want as invandrare, as immigrants into Norway, just to listen. And then at least to say hello on the street or smile. It doesn't cost, we don't have to fundraise for a smile. Each and every one of us can smile. And I think it is so important just to, I mean, for me, yes, it's about shared societies and, you know, we need to package these things, but at the same time, it's about just being human. I meet you, hello Clem, are you okay? You know, I actually wrote another poem about Norway because I found it very fascinating that in the wintertime people don't talk to each other. But in the summertime we smile at each other. And I said, you know, Norway to me is like an emotionally abusive boyfriend or partner. You know, who 1 minute is being so nice to me and the next he doesn't want to even know me, I'm invisible. But that is my experience in this new society. So I had to find a way. And thank God, you know, my bosses at Hordaland Red Cross are a bit open-minded, so they've let me run with the shared society's ideas and say, you know, no, but we're talking integration. I was like, yeah, I'm talking the same language. I may be using something else, but, you know, we're talking the same language. And I always say, you know, I'm not standing here representing Club de Madrid or Red Cross, but I'm representing the refugees in Kvam. I'm representing my little girl who's at home. I'm representing my ancestors who also spoke about these things. These are not new things. And why are we sitting here today discussing this? It's because we do not take it to the most basic level. A lot of you are parents. Teach children from a very young age these values of a shared society. But I'll leave it there and I can continue later.
I can't believe you told Clem you have nothing to give, because you have everything.
I did.
There you go.
He forced me.
You told me how you've had to deal with how people perceive you, that they've had to open their minds to understand the notion of an African, Muslim, feminist, Norwegian, now being you here. And you said that your identity as a Makua woman had so much to give Norway. So how did you find the ways to give what you have and to connect it to this community?
Through my work, I mean, one of the things, like I said, I had a set job description, but I had to change that because I realized that when people spoke about integration and social inclusion, there was a totally different mindset or idea behind it. So I said, you know what? Let's revolutionize this, let's change it. And I remember it was in 2012, there were local elections. And so all the politicians had their stands. And so I went to each political party, like, so what is your idea? How do you think you can help people coming into Norway to become integrated into this society and to feel part of this society? Not to say, oh yeah, they're here, taking our resources, but to see them as a resource in themselves. Because people come with knowledge, experience. Yeah, we may come from poverty or from war, but there's a reason why we come to Norway, because we think, oh my God, yeah, this is a safe place to be. And I mean, I must say personally, I grew up in apartheid South Africa, and I was part of the Young Women's Coalition. And Norway there was this beautiful picture about Norway's the best country. And if you think about the gender politics, it's the most progressive. And you hear all these things, wow, and then I come and, okay, is this the same Norway? But, you make do, and you sort of start working with people where they're at. So I went to the media, used the local media. We had like a series of discussions in the paper, and people were a bit frustrated. Like, it's nice to be talking about shared societies and integration, but I think it's a tad bit too much. And I was like, no, it's never too much until we see real change. And then on that, so there was, the media aspect where we ran a series for 6 weeks. Then I challenged politicians. Then we did a series in the paper, again, challenging politicians. I worked closely with the journalist, and we challenged politicians. I also run workshops with different groups. We have an international cafe that targets young people that have moved, have come into Norway, and what is tilbud? Hva tilbud på engelsk? Offer. I forget English, it's bad. But you know, a lot of young people are either in school, so they don't have other offers that are provided for people who are older or people with children. People with children find it a bit easier to come into a society as opposed to people who move to Norway alone. So creating spaces where people could meet, talk about these different issues, express how they feel. I mean, it was interesting, we had a meeting just last week and a woman said, you know, we don't want to come to Norway and be dependent on welfare. Because where we come from, to be dependent on welfare is an embarrassment. And a lot of the Norwegians were surprised because the mindset is people come here and they want to take the resources. There's a special word, Ornava, which is, NAV is the social welfare department. So people are, so workshops, different levels, different things.
You extended society to include the newcomers.
We have to. They're part of the society.
It's incredible. You're all on the front lines of shared society building. Could I invite you all up for the panel discussion? Or you're and some water. You're certainly that. Well, anyhow, the first question is for Clem, so Sarifa has time to take a sip. Yes, please. So, Clem, when you created this concept and you drafted it and worked with the Club de Madrid to build it, is this what you had in mind? Is this the kind of legwork that you knew was needed?
Well, yes, well, first of all, I'm not going to claim that I created it.
Well,
the Club de Madrid created it. But it's very much what we had in mind, and as one or two speakers said, we're not talking about something new, but we just tried to find a way to put a parameter around it which encouraged people to think afresh about it. And we hope that it gives people another insight into the practical things that they know are right and know are important. And I think you put it very well, Sarifa. I had a framework in which I could analyse what was wrong. You know, I feel in my heart that something's not quite right, but now I have a way of looking at where the thing isn't quite right. And so all of this kind of work, I think, is what we hope people will do, and we hope that it will continue to spread and grow, and other people will take it up as well.
It's incredible. And at the government level, are there specific policy interventions, things you're recommending that are concrete changes?
Well, we're trying not to be prescriptive because we believe that being prescriptive is not the right way to do things. The worst thing that one of our members can do is come along and say, this is what I did and you should do the same thing. That's a real turn-off. As I said earlier, if you come along and say, I made a mess of it, and I really missed things that I could have done, which maybe political considerations meant that at that moment weren't the right thing to do, that is something that people can identify with and relate to. So we very much start with people where they're at. What are the issues? What are the problems? How could you move forward? On our website, we have these 10 commitments listed. And then we have underneath that a set of approaches that you possibly could take. And then on our website below that again, we have examples of what people have done. And we ask people to look through these kind of ideas, not to do what someone else did, but just use them as triggers to think through where they want to go. So we don't have a prescriptive policy set, and we don't want to have it.
It's fascinating. Saji, what were you thinking when you were listening to Sarifa? How did it shake with your experience?
I was actually excited. I was smiling inside and laughing inside in joy because she reminded me of so many young people around the world who are making change in their own communities. There are more and more Sarifas in the world than we think. And it's about how do we give them the platform to amplify those voices, because the voices they are sharing is a voice of engagement in a way that is not splitting relationships apart. It's about bringing people together across those dividing lines and trying to understand how do we co-create something. And so Sarifa is one among millions of young people, and that's why I was happy, because she was perfectly articulating that here today to this audience.
And she came into this society and shared and sort of created a space, learned how to combine and connect within this context. How does that tend to work in countries where ethnic tensions, religious tensions are fault lines? How do people cross over them to do the kinds of things that Sarifa has done here?
I think most people are doing it in their own communities already. Whether it's in Sri Lanka, where I come from, where I actually grew up in a conflict area, where I saw people at time seeing, how do I put this? Even for me, to make a decision. Should I shoot someone or should I not shoot someone? Because that person took my friend's life. And to me, I feel like that's not uncommon when you're faced in a conflict situation for a young person to see if they should be taking the violent path or a peaceful path. That gap is not wide. That decision points people have at those moments are very small. The gap is very small. And how do we enable millions of young people in these countries to think about that in a way that is constructive, not destructive? So, like I said in earlier, Search for Common Ground engages with media quite a bit, but gets young people to craft and shape the media and then put the content out there on a weekly basis. But it's not just on radios and television, but also using graphic novels, using theater performances in ways that people are already organizing. So I think those kinds of things are critical because those are the ingredients or the threads that actually can help weave that community back together when it's torn apart, where you're introducing a new language, a new set of values, and a language to talk about and popularize at a societal level. So media plays a role, but it's about people actually doing that together.
Luther, is there anything education can do to create the conditions for a different decision matrix, to get young people, old people thinking differently?
The activity that comes most to my mind right now is work that we did on the West Bank for a number of years with a highly educated population of teenagers and young adults with almost no economic prospects or outlets for the intelligence and learning that they had. And we're actually able to use, and you mentioned media and the performing arts as a venue for civic engagement. And there was a Palestine's or the West Bank's most talented competitions with scholarships that led to universities in the region as well. And there was so much capacity there. And the comment that you made as well about the importance of being employed and the importance of work and engagement. That has to be one of the hugest challenges for the big youth population. What is it, 1.4 billion or so youth, or wherever we define them, with the likelihood of employment for maybe 300 million. I think that's one of the huge challenges of our time. Not only education, but getting the macro structure and economics there that really give people an opportunity to work also, which is such a meaningful part of our lives.
Participate. Sarifa, when we think about apartheid, it would seem to be the ultimate opposite of a shared society. Are there lessons from apartheid that you think apply to countries that could do better in actually making space for everyone and allowing for human potential to flourish?
No, I don't think I'm going to believe that I said this, but you know, it's so funny because I guess we were enclaves under apartheid. And so each community, to an extent, was left to do things for themselves. And we were very organized. And for me, I think under apartheid, the meaning of Ubuntu ran through every community. How do we work together? Because we had a common enemy. So we needed to organize ourselves. And we have a beautiful freedom charter also that spoke about shared societies. So I'm not sure what happened in the negotiations and the dialogue, towards the transition process, that seemed to have been lost in the process somehow. And we took over and yeah, okay, fair enough, we only got political power, not economic power. But still I think that, a lot could have been done. The TRC process, which again was an amazing idea, but in terms of the implementation was very problematic. And I must say, I think that was one of the reasons why I wish that Nziza was here, because she was part of the TRC process that sidelined women, that did not help our society, and Club de Madrid has it in the commitments and sort of the process of how do we do that, how to heal as a nation. We never had that opportunity. So the psychological implications of apartheid still exist in South Africa today. So there's a lot there, and I would say to people, certain things don't do. Do not allow the capitalist agenda to drive your development or your transition process. And that's what happened in South Africa. We want to become part of the global economy, and so therefore we need to make sacrifices when it comes to social service deliveries and so forth. So we cut down on education, and a lot of people, when again, you've been, fellow panelists have been talking about it, that a lot of girls are at home, they don't go to school, and therefore there's a lot of activity on the ground to ensure the empowerment and education of girls. But if you cut down on social services, that means you're cutting down on the education, especially for girls, because they're the first ones to be pulled out of school, and especially girls in rural communities. So there's a lot to learn from South Africa. We have a beautiful spirit, a beautiful energy, people that are always smiling, and we always, look to working together on certain levels, but there's a lot also that you should be wary about. It's not all hunky-dory. I hope I answered your question.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I'm just
A very rich experience. Any questions from the floor? We'll start with this enthusiastic hand raising. Is there a microphone?
I think I'm loud enough.
Of course.
Hi, I'd like to actually employ your expertise as a panel for a problem which exists right now in my country. I'm from Kenya, and now we're facing a huge problem with the Somali population in Kenya. We recently, in 2011, went to war with the terror group in Somalia, Al-Shabaab, and now what happened is they have guerrilla attacks in Nairobi, Mombasa, etc. Now what happens is the Kenyans are becoming very xenophobic, and are becoming they have a stigma against the Somali. We have the Ethiopian, Eritreans, so essentially it's foreign people living in Kenya. And for me, it's two questions. Number one, how do you fight that stigma? And number two, how do you give the foreign or immigrant or minority groups in Kenya an identity as Kenyans?
Saji, would you like to take it?
I was going to ask colleagues from Africa to start answering that question first before us outsiders do that. But
Yeah, I think one of the sad things about Africa as a continent is that we were cut up. And so we see each other that, the colonial mentality still exists. You are different from us. You are this and you are that. And as human beings, we always like to put a label on people instead of looking at, this is a fellow human being. And I think we spoke about that. What do we have in common as human beings that we could, we had xenophobic attacks also in South Africa. And I think it's quite sad because a lot of people were killed in Cape Town because they were very accessible. It's easy, you're frustrated with an entire system. But the only way that you can vent is to the most vulnerable. And those were the refugees that came from Somalia, that came from Ethiopia. They were attacked, they were visible, they were there in these communities because they were seen as stealing resources. So in terms of tackling this problem, it's not just about, it deals with leadership. Politicians to engage and discuss this issue. It deals with conscientizing people. Because for me, as an African, I think, there are certain African values, or even religious values that speak to, brotherhood and sisterhood, respect for each other. Why do you go to church and the masjid to pray if you're going to kill your brother and sister? Because Islam speaks about peace. Christianity speaks about love thy neighbor. What? Love thy neighbor as long as he or she is Kenyan. Love thy neighbor irrespective. And these are the issues that we need to remind our communities about. And it starts especially with you guys, with us, with the youth, in terms of saying, you know what, we're tired, leadership is not doing its job. Let's organize ourselves, engage with Somali youth, engage with Ethiopian youth, find commonality. You spoke about it earlier on, and see how together you can challenge leadership that is not really doing their work.
can I piggyback on that? Off the cuff, just taking Kenya out of the picture, right? Because we talked about the role young people play here. In northern Nigeria, hashtag Bring Back Our Girls was started by young local Nigerians. Right now it became a global movement. What did that do? It put pressure on Goodluck Jonathan's administration to respond. It was young people who started it. Historically, movements were started by young people. It put pressure on governments or authoritarian regimes to react or respond in a way. But what happens was they respond in a not so constructive way sometimes. But so going back to the situation in Kenya, honestly, organizing cultural exhibitions, conversations, trust-building activities between 100 or 200 is not going to address the overall bigger problem that you just brought up, right? What's your population? What's the total population in your country?
42 million.
42 million. And what's the Somali refugee population like?
All Somalia of 2.4 million.
So, when you train a few people, it's very difficult to transform a society. So you have to look at how do you scale something like that. So when you try to scale, you have to look at engaging with media to use media tools as one way of giving examples of constructive relationships that are not divisive but are common, what people share in common between the different identities people have in Kenya, and popularize that. If you search for common ground, there's in Kenya and other places using football or soccer, putting it on television, but uses the challenges people have that divide them as an entry point for having conversations about what they have in common. Because as a young boy or a young girl who is Kenyan, it's the same values they have with somebody who is not Kenyan, who is also living in the same neighborhood. And popularize that and make that the cool thing to see for people. And the more you're repeating that, the more we are embedding a new set of languages, tools, and ideas of what's possible. So you're getting people to have a new conversation. But television, radio is one tool, but you have to have that local conversation to make sure you go deep. So in those cultural clubs and sports clubs and all that, you deepen those things when it's happening at the national level. Don't wait for the government to do it. Make the government do it by making it popular locally.
Amazing. We have time for one last question.
You mentioned how work or employment feeds into or creates shared society. Can you talk more about that?
Reserved, but who would want to take it?
All right, couple quick comments. I want to add to what Sanjay said also, just the example of the Interfaith Youth Corps in the U.S. www.iyfc.org, founded by an Ismaili Muslim, Ibo Patel, Rhodes Scholar, the big book, Acts of Faith, which in the U.S., which granted doesn't have the same volatility as lots of other places that we're talking about, is bringing together people 20s, 30s of ardent faith, whether they're Shiite or Sunni or Ismaili or Orthodox Jew or evangelical Christian or mainline, et cetera, et cetera. It's a wonderful phenomenon to observe, that kind of mobilization, and I just wish that it could go international. Addressing the employment issue, which is really a meaning issue as well. It's both a micro and a macro challenge in places like Haiti, for example. There have been such massive interventions and efforts to create entrepreneurship, to work with local and community organizations, to give work preparedness and skills training, but you also need an investment climate that will create the greater environment. From what I'm reading, there's such hope in Africa. There's a book out recently called Success is Africa, a compendium of comments by CEOs who are working in Africa. Africa has half the world's fastest growing economies, administrations that are markedly more transparent and better educated than the regimes of the immediate post-colonial period, the ubiquity of communications devices as well, the self-investment, the percentage of budgets, government budgets that are actually going into education, which dwarfs what we do in the West. There is so much to be hopeful about in that place, and how to accentuate the positive, even through these difficult transition periods of the negative as well. But also to the point of workforce development, I think the importance, and you mentioned communications also, Sanjay, of establishing links to diaspora communities. as well. And what's happening already, and could happen so much more abundantly, by tying together the young people in Somalia with their contemporaries, whether it's in Norway or Minneapolis or Sweden. And the communications devices exist for that. And I think there's a lot of interchange of that kind that not only can give a sense of wholeness and possibility, but also practical advice also about developing lives, developing careers, developing work.
Very practical idea. We're very quickly.
Very quickly,
Sadiko.
I think, if I may add on to this, we as civil society actors, we know that one of the biggest challenges is unemployment issue. So what we do is create jobs. It's kind of like when somebody is displaced, we give them a house. But what they really need is a home. If you look at ourselves even, why are we working in the field we are in? Because it gives us a sense of dignity, it gives us a sense of identity. And we miss those things in the job creation elements. And the entrepreneurship is fantastic, but in divided societies, entrepreneurship only benefits the few, the elite, the English speakers, or the NGO speaking, UN language speaking people. Not often the others who all fall through the cracks. So we have to be sensitive to make sure the good intentions we have don't cause harm, because that can actually spiral into something more dangerous. We have to be very careful on how we do this, especially in developing countries where relationships are very fragile. Quickly, very briefly.
Clem, final word?
Yeah, I think all over the world we all have very similar aspirations, and we all want to fulfill ourselves, and we want to be something with ourselves, and as I was just saying, work is one of the ways to do that. But very often those avenues are blocked, and we then say these people don't want to work. In fact, it's the marginalised people who work the hardest. They're working incredibly hard, perhaps to produce a crop out of really unyielding land with no resources. But what we need to do is, the ILO says, is to find ways in which there is decent work for all. And if we provide the right kind of environment, if we provide the right kind of opportunities, those people then fulfill themselves, and they create and achieve things and contribute back into society. It's such a waste of the individual, but it's such a waste of the society if we don't create the circumstances in which people can really fulfill themselves. So it's all about people having an opportunity to fulfill their aspirations.
Clem, Luther, Saji, Sarifa, thank you so much. And to be a final thought, Orlin himself.
Laura, I don't have a question, I have a compliment. I just want to compliment, I want to frame this very carefully because I don't want anyone to think that I'm surprised. But I want to compliment you on how well you shaped shared societies. You really did a good job. We pulled you in just a few weeks ago, and you're becoming a part of the team. And I want to say a word about Club of Madrid and shared societies. We were first drawn in Partnership for Change to Club of Madrid, of course, because of the aura of the 96 former heads of state, and bringing together the intergenerational aspect of the heads of state as the role model mentors, together with the youth that are helping to frame our Minnesota 2015 conference in October next year. And but shared society has become the glue that's really pulled us together and really made us a family. So we're working very closely with Club of Madrid and shared societies now for the future. Saji, I'm so pleased that you brought in that personal dimension, your journey from Sri Lanka. That was a defining moment for you, and we've talked about it before, and it's so powerful. And Sarifa, I don't know you yet, but the rest are good friends, but I want to know you very well, because you are remarkable. You know, I'm hesitant to say this. I'm glad you're in Norway because that's my heritage, but I'd like to see you and people like you everywhere. You were terrific, and I'm so glad that Clem brought you in. And my fellow Minnesotan, Luther, it's great to have you up as part of this panel again as well. Thank you so much, all of you.